Ancient Egypt, civilization in northeastern Africa that dates from the 4th millennium BCE. Its many achievements, preserved in its art and monuments, hold a fascination that continues to grow as archaeological finds expose its secrets. This video focuses on Egypt from its prehistory through its unification under Menes, Narmer, in the 3rd millennium BCE, sometimes used as a reference point for Egypt's origin, and up to the Islamic conquest in the 7th century CE. For subsequent history through the contemporary period. Life in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt can be thought of as an oasis in the desert of northeastern Africa, dependent on the annual inundation of the Nile River to support its agricultural population. The country's chief wealth came from the fertile floodplain of the Nile Valley, where the river flows between bands of limestone hills, and the Nile Delta, in which it fans into several branches north of present-day Cairo. Between the floodplain and the hills is a variable band of low desert that supported a certain amount of game. The Nile was Egypt's sole transportation artery. The first cataract at Assuan, where the riverbed is turned into rapids by a belt of granite, was the country's only well-defined boundary within a populated area. To the south lay the far less hospitable area of Nubia, in which the river flowed through low sandstone hills that in most regions left only a very narrow strip of cultivable land. Nubia was significant for Egypt's periodic southward expansion and for access to products from farther south. West of the Nile was the arid Sahara, broken by a chain of oases some 125 to 185 miles from the river, and lacking in all other resources except for a few minerals. The eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea was more important, for it supported a small nomadic population and desert game, contained numerous mineral deposits, including gold, and was the route to the Red Sea. To the northeast was the Isthmus of Suez. It offered the principal route for contact with Sinai, from which came turquoise and possibly copper, and with southwestern Asia, Egypt's most important area of cultural interaction, from which were received stimuli for technical development and cultivars for crops. Immigrants and ultimately invaders crossed the isthmus into Egypt, attracted by the country's stability and prosperity. From the late 2nd millennium BCE onward, numerous attacks were made by land and sea along the eastern Mediterranean coast. At first, relatively little cultural contact came by way of the Mediterranean Sea, but from an early date Egypt maintained trading relations with the Lebanese port of Byblos, present-day Jbeil. Egypt needed few imports to maintain basic standards of living, but good timber was essential, and not available within the country, so it usually was obtained from Lebanon. Minerals such as obsidian and lapis lazuli were imported from as far afield as Anatolia and Afghanistan. Agriculture centered on the cultivation of cereal crops, chiefly emmer wheat, Triticum dicoccum, and barley, Hordeum vulgare. The fertility of the land and general predictability of the inundation ensured very high productivity from a single annual crop. This productivity made it possible to store large surpluses against crop failures, and also formed the chief basis of Egyptian wealth, which was, until the creation of the large empires of the 1st millennium BCE, the greatest of any state in the ancient Middle East. Basin irrigation was achieved by simple means, and multiple cropping was not feasible until much later times, except perhaps in the lakeside area of Al-Fayoum. As the river deposited alluvial silt, raising the level of the floodplain, and land was reclaimed from marsh, the area available for cultivation in the Nile Valley and Delta increased, while pastoralism declined slowly. In addition to grain crops, fruit and vegetables were important, the latter being irrigated year-round in small plots. Fish was also vital to the diet. Papyrus, which grew abundantly in marshes, was gathered wild, and in later times was cultivated. It may have been used as a food crop, and it certainly was used to make rope, matting, and sandals. Above all, it provided the characteristic Egyptian writing material, which, with cereals, was the country's chief export in late-period Egyptian and then Greco-Roman times. Cattle may have been domesticated in northeastern Africa. The Egyptians kept many as draft animals, and for their various products, showing some of the interest in breeds and individuals that is found to this day in the Sudan and eastern Africa. The donkey, which was the principal transport animal, the camel did not become common until Roman times, was probably domesticated in the region. The native Egyptian breed of sheep became extinct in the 2nd millennium BCE and was replaced by an Asiatic breed. Sheep were primarily a source of meat. Their wool was rarely used. Goats were more numerous than sheep. Pigs were also raised and eaten. Ducks and geese were kept for food, and many of the vast numbers of wild and migratory birds found in Egypt were hunted and trapped. Desert game, principally various species of antelope and ibex, were hunted by the elite. It was a royal privilege to hunt lions and wild cattle. Pets included dogs, which were also used for hunting, cats, and monkeys. In addition, the Egyptians had a great interest in and knowledge of most species of mammals, birds, reptiles, and fish in their environment. Most Egyptians were probably descended from settlers who moved to the Nile Valley in prehistoric times, with population increase coming through natural fertility. In various periods there were immigrants from Nubia, Libya, and especially the Middle East. They were historically significant and also may have contributed to population growth, but their numbers are unknown. Most people lived in villages and towns in the Nile Valley and Delta. Dwellings were normally built of mud brick and have long since disappeared beneath the rising water table or beneath modern town sites, thereby obliterating evidence for settlement patterns. In antiquity, as now, the most favored location of settlements was on slightly raised ground near the riverbank, where transport and water were easily available and flooding was unlikely. Until the 1st millennium BCE, Egypt was not urbanized to the same extent as Mesopotamia. Instead, a few centers, notably Memphis and Thebes, attracted population and particularly the elite, while the rest of the people were relatively evenly spread over land. The size of the population has been estimated as having risen from 1 to 1.5 million in the 3rd millennium BCE to perhaps twice that number in the late 2nd millennium and 1st millennium BCE. Much higher levels of population were reached in Greco-Roman times. Nearly all of the people were engaged in agriculture and were probably tied to the land. In theory, all the land belonged to the king, although in practice, those living on it could not easily be removed, and some categories of land could be bought and sold. Land was assigned to high officials to provide them with an income, and most tracts required payment of substantial dues to the state, which had a strong interest in keeping the land in agricultural use. Abandoned land was taken back into state ownership and reassigned for cultivation. The people who lived on and worked the land were not free to leave and were obliged to work it. But they were not slaves. Most paid a proportion of their produce to major officials. Free citizens who worked the land on their own behalf did emerge. Terms applied to them tended originally to refer to poor people, but these agriculturalists were probably not poor. Slavery was never common, being restricted to captives and foreigners, or to people who were forced by poverty or debt to sell themselves into service. Slaves sometimes even married members of their owners' families, so that in the long term those belonging to households tended to be assimilated into free society. In the New Kingdom, from about 1539 to 1075 BCE, large numbers of captive slaves were acquired by major state institutions or incorporated into the army. Punitive treatment of foreign slaves or of native fugitives from their obligations included forced labor, exile, in, for example, the oases of the Western Desert, or compulsory enlistment in dangerous mining expeditions. Even non-punitive employment such as quarrying in the desert was hazardous. The official record of one expedition shows a mortality rate of more than 10%. Just as the Egyptians optimized agricultural production with simple means, their crafts and techniques, many of which originally came from Asia, were raised to extraordinary levels of perfection. The Egyptians' most striking technical achievement, massive stone building, also exploited the potential of a centralized state to mobilize a huge labor force, which was made available by efficient agricultural practices. Some of the technical and organizational skills involved were remarkable. The construction of the Great Pyramids of the Fourth Dynasty, 2575 to 2465 BCE, has yet to be fully explained and would be a major challenge to this day. This expenditure of skill contrasts with sparse evidence of an essentially Neolithic way of living for the rural population of the time, while the use of flint tools persisted even in urban environments at least until the late 2nd millennium BCE. Metal was correspondingly scarce, much of it being used for prestige rather than everyday purposes. In urban and elite contexts, the Egyptian ideal was the nuclear family, but on the land and even within the central ruling group, there is evidence for extended families. Egyptians were monogamous, and the choice of partners in marriage, for which no formal ceremony or legal sanction is known, did not follow a set pattern. Consanguineous marriage was not practiced during the dynastic period, except for the occasional marriage of a brother and sister within the royal family, and that practice may have been open only to kings or heirs to the throne. Divorce was in theory easy, but it was costly. Women had a legal status only marginally inferior to that of men. They could own and dispose of property in their own right, and they could initiate divorce and other legal proceedings. They hardly ever held administrative office, but increasingly were involved in religious cults as priestesses or chantresses. Married women held the title mistress of the house, the precise significance of which is unknown. Lower down the social scale, they probably worked on the land as well as in the house. The uneven distribution of wealth, labor, and technology was related to the only partly urban character of society, especially in the 3rd millennium BCE. The country's resources were not fed into numerous provincial towns, but instead were concentrated to great effect around the capital itself, a dispersed string of settlements, rather than a city, and focused on the central figure in society, the king. In the 3rd and early 2nd millennia, the elite ideal, expressed in the decoration of private tombs, was manorial and rural. Not until much later did Egyptians develop a more pronouncedly urban character. The king and ideology. In cosmogonical terms, Egyptian society consisted of a descending hierarchy of the gods, the king, the blessed dead, and humanity, by which was understood chiefly the Egyptians. Of these groups, only the king was single, and hence he was individually more prominent than any of the others. A text that summarizes the king's role states that he is on earth forever and ever, judging mankind and propitiating the gods, and setting order in place of disorder. He gives offerings to the gods and mortuary offerings to the spirits. The king was imbued with divine essence, but not in any simple or unqualified sense. His divinity accrued to him from his office and was reaffirmed through rituals, but it was vastly inferior to that of major gods. He was God rather than man by virtue of his potential, which was immeasurably greater than that of any human being. To humanity, he manifested the gods on earth, a conception that was elaborated in a complex web of metaphor and doctrine. Less directly, he represented humanity to the gods. The text quoted above also gives great prominence to the dead, who were the object of a cult for the living, and who could intervene in human affairs. In many periods, the chief visible expenditure and focus of display of non-royal individuals, as of the king, was on provision for the tomb and the next world. Egyptian kings are commonly called pharaohs, following the usage of the Bible. The term pharaoh, however, is derived from the Egyptian Pharaoh, great estate, and dates to the designation of the royal palace as an institution. This term for palace was used increasingly from about 1400 BCE. As a way of referring to the living king. In earlier times, it was rare. Rules of succession to the kingship are poorly understood. The common conception that the heir to the throne had to marry his predecessor's oldest daughter has been disproved. Kingship did not pass through the female line. The choice of queen seems to have been free. Often the queen was a close relative of the king, but she also might be unrelated to him. In the New Kingdom, for which evidence is abundant, each king had a queen with distinctive titles, as well as a number of minor wives. Sons of the chief queen seem to have been the preferred successors to the throne, but other sons could also become king. In many cases, the successor was the eldest, surviving son, and such a pattern of inheritance agrees with more general Egyptian values. But often he was some other relative or was completely unrelated. New Kingdom texts describe, after the event, how kings were appointed heirs, either by their predecessors or by divine oracles, and such may have been the pattern when there was no clear successor. Dissent and conflict are suppressed from public sources. From the late period, 664 to 332 BCE, when sources are more diverse and patterns less rigid, numerous usurpations and interruptions to the succession are known. They probably had many forerunners. The king's position changed gradually from that of an absolute monarch at the center of a small ruling group, made up mostly of his kin, to that of the head of a bureaucratic state, in which his rule was still absolute based on office holding and, in theory, on free competition and merit. By the Fifth Dynasty, fixed institutions had been added to the force of tradition and the regulation of personal contact as brakes on autocracy. But the charismatic and superhuman power of the king remained vital. The elite of administrative office holders received their positions and commissions from the king, whose general role as judge over humanity they put into effect. They commemorated their own justice and concern for others, especially their inferiors, and recorded their own exploits and ideal conduct of life in inscriptions for others to see. Thus, the position of the elite was affirmed by reference to the king, to their prestige among their peers, and to their conduct toward their subordinates, justifying to some extent the fact that they, and still more, the king appropriated much of the country's production. These attitudes and their potential dissemination through society counterbalanced inequality, but how far they were accepted cannot be known. The core group of wealthy office holders numbered at most a few hundred, and the administrative class of minor officials and scribes, most of whom could not afford to leave memorials or inscriptions, perhaps 5,000. With their dependents, these two groups formed perhaps 5% of the early population. Monuments and inscriptions commemorated no more than 1 in 1,000 people. According to royal ideology, the king appointed the elite on the basis of merit, and in ancient conditions of high mortality, the elite had to be open to recruits from outside. There was, however, also an ideal that a son should succeed his father. In periods of weak central control, this principle predominated, and in the late period, the whole society became more rigid and stratified. The recovery and study of ancient Egypt. European interest in ancient Egypt was strong in Roman times and revived in the Renaissance, when the wealth of Egyptian remains in the city of Rome was supplemented by information provided by visitors to Egypt itself. Views of Egypt were dominated by the classical tradition that it was the land of ancient wisdom. This wisdom was thought to inhere in the hieroglyphic script, which was believed to impart profound symbolic ideas, not as it in fact does the sounds and words of texts. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, Egypt had a minor but significant position in general views of antiquity, and its monuments gradually became better known through the work of scholars in Europe and travelers in the country itself. The finest publications of the latter were by Richard Pococki, Frederick Ludwig Norden, and Karsten Niebuhr, all of whose works in the 18th century helped to stimulate an Egyptian revival in European art and architecture. Coptic, the Christian successor of the ancient Egyptian language, was studied from the 17th century, notably by Athanasius Kircher, for its potential to provide the key to Egyptian. Napoleon's first expedition to and short-lived conquest of Egypt in 1798 was the culmination of 18th-century interest in the East. The expedition was accompanied by a team of scholars who recorded the ancient and contemporary country, issuing in 1809-28 the description d'Egypte, the most comprehensive study to be made before the decipherment of the hieroglyphic script. The renowned Rosetta Stone, which bears a decree of Ptolemy V Epiphanes in hieroglyphs, Demotic script, and Greek alphabetic characters, was discovered during the expedition. It was ceded to the British after the French capitulation in Egypt and became the property of the British Museum in London. This document greatly assisted the decipherment, accomplished by Jean-François Champollion in 1822. The Egyptian language revealed by the decipherment and decades of subsequent study is a member of the Afro-Asiatic, formerly Hamido-Semitic, language family. Egyptian is closest to the family's Semitic branch, but is distinctive in many respects. During several millennia, it changed greatly. The script does not write vowels, and because Greek forms for royal names were known from Manetho long before the Egyptian forms became available, those used to this day are a mixture of Greek and Egyptian. In the first half of the 19th century, vast numbers of antiquities were exported from Egypt, forming the nucleus of collections in many major museums. These were removed rather than excavated, inflicting, together with the economic development of the country, colossal damage on ancient sites. At the same time, many travelers and scholars visited the country and recorded the monuments. The most important and remarkably accurate record was produced by the Prussian expedition led by Karl Richard Lepsius in 1842-45, which explored sites as far south as the central Sudan. In the mid-19th century, Egyptology developed as a subject in France and in Prussia. The Antiquities Service and a Museum of Egyptian Antiquities were established in Egypt by the French Egyptologist Auguste Mariette, a great excavator who attempted to preserve sites from destruction, and the Prussian Heinrich Bruggs, who made great progress in the interpretation of texts of many periods and published the first major Egyptian dictionary. In 1880, Flinders, later Sir Flinders, Petrie began more than 40 years of methodical excavation, which created an archaeological framework for all the chief periods of Egyptian culture, except for remote prehistory. Petrie was the initiator of much in archaeological method, but he was later surpassed by George Andrew Reisner, who excavated for American institutions from 1899 to 1937. The greatest late 19th century Egyptologist was Adolf Erman of Berlin, who put the understanding of the Egyptian language on a sound basis and wrote general works that for the first time organized what was known about the earlier period. Complete facsimile copies of Egyptian monuments have been published since the 1890, providing a separate record that becomes more vital as the originals decay. The pioneer of this scientific epigraphy was James Henry Breasted of the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, who began his work in 1905 and shortly thereafter was joined by others. Many scholars are now engaged in epigraphy. In the first half of the 20th century, some outstanding archaeological discoveries were made. Howard Carter uncovered the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922. Pierre Montet found the tombs of 21 and 22 dynasty kings at Tantus in 1939-44. W. B. Emery and L. P. Kirwan found tombs of the Balna culture, the 4th through the 6th century CE in Nubia, in 1931 to 34. The last of these was part of the second survey of Lower Nubia in 1929 to 34, which preceded the second raising of the Assuan Dam. This was followed in the late 1950 and 1960 by an international campaign to excavate and record sites in Egyptian and Sudanese Nubia before the completion of the Aswan High Dam in 1970. Lower Nubia is now one of the most thoroughly explored archaeological regions of the world. Most of its many temples have been moved, either to higher ground nearby, as happened to Abu Simbel and Philae, or to quite different places, including various foreign museums. The campaign also had the welcome consequence of introducing a wide range of archaeological expertise to Egypt, so that standards of excavation and recording in the country have risen greatly. Excavation and survey of great importance have continued in many places. For example, at Aqara, part of the necropolis of the ancient city of Memphis, new areas of the Serapeum have been uncovered with rich finds, and a major New Kingdom necropolis is being thoroughly explored. The site of ancient Memphis itself has been systematically surveyed. Its position in relation to the ancient course of the Nile has been established, and urban occupation areas have been studied in detail for the first time. Egyptology is, however, a primarily interpretive subject. There have been outstanding contributions, for example, in art, for which Heinrich Schwier established the principles of the rendering of nature, and in language. New light has been cast on texts, the majority of which are written in a simple meter that can serve as the basis of sophisticated literary works. The physical environment, social structure, kingship, and religion are other fields in which great advances have been made, while the reconstruction of the outline of history is constantly being improved in detail. If you like our videos, then share with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more interesting videos.